I'll just mention what's up on the screen there. I prepared a handout, but I didn't print enough copies for the audience. I'm impressed with the number of people in the audience. So my handout is projected on the screen instead. That means there may be some moments during my talk where I'll need to go across to the computer and scroll it down, but it's not essential in any case, so don't worry if you don't get a good view of the projection. Due to the time constraints, I'll dive into my paper pretty shortly, but I just wanted to make a couple of connections with two of the presentations from yesterday morning. Firstly, Philippe Mars was, well, in the background of Philippe's talk was the proposal that the Vyasa Bhashya, the commentary that's attributed to Vyasa on the Yoga Sutra, is in fact an auto-commentary by the author of the Yoga Sutra itself. And in some ways, my paper presupposes the falsehood of that contention. Or it might even constitute one element in a potential argument against it. Well, that might be over ambitious, but we'll see. The other paper, Kevin Marufkani, is Kevin here?
Stepped out.
He stepped out, okay. Yeah. Kevin's paper that he has been working on in conjunction with Arindam Chakrabarti takes for granted the idea that the Kaivalyapada, the final chapter, the final pada of the Yoga Sutra, contains within it at least an attempt to refute Yogacara Buddhist idealism. And my presentation is an attempt to refute that thesis. So my presentation is in sort of critical dialogue with that, although that was only a starting point for Kevin's presentation yesterday. So I'll dive into my paper. Among the interpretive claims commonly made about classical yoga, the yoga of the Yoga Sutra, and its close philosophical cousin, classical Samkhya, three of the most prevalent are the following. Firstly, that these two philosophical systems are metaphysically dualist. Secondly, that they consider Prakriti, also referred to in the Yoga Sutra as Drishya, to be a material principle. And thirdly, that they are philosophically realist. These three claims are interrelated. The Prakriti is one of the two poles regarded as constituting metaphysical dualism. And it is Prakriti and the further principles that emerge from it or from her that Yoga and Samkhya are held to be realist about. What complicates the interpretive situation, however, is that the attribution of realism is often made first without consideration of what Prakriti and its emergent principles are, and hence second without any account of how this form of realism relates to the sorts of viewpoints with which the term realism is typically associated in Western philosophy, from which the term realism derives. The temptation for interpreters, once Prakriti has been defined as a material principle, is to treat Prakriti, material principle, and the world as equivalent terms, and then to either state explicitly or to leave it to be assumed that what Yoga and Samkhya are realist about is the world of material objects. There is, however, a problem with this interpretation, which reveals itself when one examines the descriptions of the two co-ultimate metaphysical principles, namely Purusha and Prakriti, or the Siya, Drashta, and the Seeable, Drishya, as presented in the classical texts. This paper, my paper, draws upon material from a larger project that I've carried out, in which I question whether the attribution of realism to Yoga and Samkhya is sustainable when one takes into account the overall philosophical and soteriological positions of these darshans. I don't dispute the claim that Yoga and Samkhya are metaphysically dualist. Dualism is indeed one of their defining characteristics. What is often overlooked, however, is that the nature of the dualism, and hence the two basic principles, need to be carefully examined before we can assume that it makes sense in the context of Yoga and Samkhya to speak of a dichotomy between an experiencing subject and a world of mind-independent objects. A full version of my argument would require detailed discussion of the concept of property, which I've provided to some extent in the larger project, we don't have time for here. What I'll do in the present paper is focus on a particular passage in the Yoga Sutra that's been seized on by many commentators, both traditional and modern, as evidence of yoga's realism and its opposition to idealism. I shall argue that the status of that evidence is far from clear. So it's not a strong thesis that I've got here, but that's the claim. A series of sutras in the Kaivalyapada, the fourth chapter of the Yoga Sutra, is widely held to contain a polemic against the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism. This Buddhist school is estimated to have flourished in India from the 4th to the 12th centuries CE, and is championed by figures such as Maitreya, Asanga, Vasubandhu, and Stiramati. It is well known for promoting what is typically interpreted as a kind of idealism. The central principle of which is referred to variously as vijnana or vignapti, each of which terms can be rendered as consciousness, cognition, discernment, and so forth. And sometimes also called chitta, which again can be translated as consciousness or as mind. The doctrine is thus termed Vijnanavada, literally consciousness view, understood to be the view that reality is exclusively mental or ideational. Since the early 1980s, this idealist interpretation of Yogacara has been questioned by some scholars who contend that the Yogacara approach doesn't postulate a supreme mental principle and is better construed as something like a realistic pluralism or phenomenology. The interpretive situation is therefore complicated, and I don't intend to enter into this dispute here. For my present purpose, what needs to be noted is that those scholars who regard the Yoga Sutra as containing an anti-Yogacara critique bring to the issue two main presuppositions. One is that Yogačara's Vijnanavada is a form of absolute idealism. The other is that an attack on such idealism is itself a defence of realism about the physical world. I shall argue that the passage in question is not unambiguously realist and shows no explicit signs of being directed against Yogacara or any other school of Buddhism. The passage in question begins at Yoga Sutra 4.14 and continues through to 4.22, or according to at least one interpreter, 4.23. I think I heard maybe it was Kevin yesterday suggesting he goes through to 4.24. I'm not sure, but that series of sutras roughly around there. Although there's no direct reference to the Vijnanavada in any of these sutras, several traditional commentators from Vyasa onwards have interpreted them as polemical in nature and have, in their respective commentaries, vented their own opposition to the Vijnanavada. Modern scholars have, on the whole, accepted the traditional interpretations, citing the passage as evidence both of yoga's alleged realism and of the Yoga Sutra's date being not earlier than the 3rd century CE. Regarding the latter claim, James Woods proposes that this is the first quotation on the handout on the projection that I'm referring to here. James Woods proposes that although we can't be certain whether the version of the Vijnanavada quote attacked by the Yoga Sutra must be the idealism of Vasubandhu, a proponent of the Buddhist Yogacara school, there remains a great probability that it is. This supposition is based almost entirely on the occurrence in Vachaspati Mishra's 9th or 10th century commentary of a reference to a Vijnanavadi, whom Woods thinks is unlikely to be anyone other than Vasubandhu. Woods appears not to consider that regardless of whether Vachaspati is referring to Vasubandhu, this is not in itself sufficient to demonstrate that the original sutra also has him, or indeed any other Buddhist philosopher, in mind. Nevertheless, the view that the sutras are criticising Vasubandhu has become commonplace. Surendranath Dasgupta, in his History of Indian Philosophy, challenges Wood's estimate of the Yoga Sutra's date, though not on the grounds that Woods attaches undue significance to Vachaspati's commentary. Rather, Dasgupta contends that the whole Kaivalyapada is an interpolation and therefore cannot be used to place a limit on the antiquity of the other three chapters. If Dasgupta is right that the Kaivalyapada is a later edition, then even if it did contain passages defending realism about the physical world, we couldn't conclude that the yoga system as a whole advocates this view. Since, however, it's unlikely that the issue of the text's integrity will be resolved decisively, it's worth asking whether the series of sutras that purportedly argues for realism does in fact do so. As I don't have time here to consider the whole series of sutras, I should have to be selective. It tends to be sutras 14 and 15 of chapter 4 that elicit the strongest anti-idealist rhetoric from traditional commentators. But even to deal with both of those sutras would be ambitious. So I should concentrate on first of them, 4.14. Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, that's helpful. Sutra 4.14 comprises the following brief statement: Parinama ekatvad vastu tattvam. A fairly literal translation would be something like, due to the oneness of the transformation, the thatness of an object. Because the immediately preceding sutra identifies the three strands, the gunas, as the essence or atman of objects or properties of something that are either manifest, vyakta, or subtle, sukshma. The term parinama ekatva may be understood to denote the unity of the transformations of these three strands. Vastu tattva, meanwhile, can be understood to mean the existence of an object, literally the fact that it is. Neither thatness nor existence is an unequivocal term. One might maintain, for example, as did Immanuel Kant, both that the existence of an object considered as a thing in itself is independent of the object's being perceived, and that the object's formal existence, how it appears to us, is subject-dependent. In other words, one might speak of objects as empirically real without thereby admitting that they have formal spatio-temporal existence independently of their being perceived by anyone. In the case of the term vastu tattva, it isn't clear whether tattva means empirical existence or alternatively subject-independent existence. Any interpreter who's decided in advance that Yoga's position is realist about perceptual objects is likely to give it the latter meaning. But such a reading comes under strain when we recall that the process of transformation, parinama, referred to in the sutra, by means of which objects come to be experienced, is not independent of perceptual capacities. On the contrary, the transformation in question is the transformation of the gunas, which precisely constitutes the emergence of the factors that make perceptual experience possible. Important among these latter factors are the perceptual capacities designated in Samkhya by the terms buddhi, ahankara, manas, and 5 buddhindriyas. Terms which are typically rendered as respectively intellect, egoity, mind, and the 5 sense capacities. Although the terminology in the Yoga Sutra differs from that in the Samkhya-Karika, interpreters generally agree that roughly the same system of manifest principles is alluded to in Yoga Sutra 2.19, which outlines the stages of the transformation of the gunas. Thus, if what emerges from the parinama process is not only objects, but also our capacities to have those objects as part of our experience, then the unity or integrity of that process, parinama, can hardly be considered responsible for the subject-independent reality of the objects. Rather, parinama, the transformation of the ontological strands known as gunas, is the making possible of empirical reality. It is objects as they appear to us, whose existence is dependent upon the oneness of parinama. The objects are independent of any particular mind, but not of cognitive activities more generally. But those activities are the condition of the objects appearing at all. What the épatoire of the process, its oneness, unity, or integrity consists in, is the coherence of a specific configuration of the ontological strands. It is this configuration, parinama épatoire, that gives rise to, or is equivalent to, the formal manifest existence of empirical objects, that's the tattva. Whether or not the interpretation I've just offered is accepted, now that the wording of the sutra has been introduced, we can turn to what the best-known traditional commentators, Vyasa and Vachaspati Mishra, have to say about it. On Vyasa's reading, the sutra asserts the object's independence of the subject's awareness, vijnana. He refers to an opposing opinion according to which physical objects are unreal in a way that's analogous to the unreality of dream images. The view Vyasa attributes to his opponent is as follows. Quote, and is this visible there? Yeah. There is no object, artha, unaccompanied by cognition, vijnana. There is, however, knowledge, jnana, unaccompanied by an object, as in a dream. The terms vijnana and jnana are here used as synonyms, or near synonyms. I translated them on etymological grounds as cognition and knowledge, respectively, although their sense in this extract seems closer to that of a term such as phenomenal representation, or mental image, or something like that. Something that may or may not represent an independently real entity. In short, the view mentioned by Vyasa is that with which Yogacara Buddhism is typically associated, namely that objects encountered in waking consciousness are, like dream images, lacking in any substantial basis independent of consciousness itself. If Vyasa's remark is indeed an attack on Yogacara philosophy, then, like many others, he evidently takes that philosophy to be idealist, regarding it as an untenable attempt to, quote, conceal the true nature of the object, its vastu swarupa, by asserting that the object is a mere fabrication of knowledge, jnana. That is, a mere appearance, and hence not genuine knowledge at all. Vyasa says little, however, to support his objection. He simply declares that, quote, the object stands presented as this, idam, by its own power. Could somebody help me out? Just move the projection down a little. Yeah, that's good. Anima Sen Gupta, a modern exegete of yoga, explicates Vyasa's statement as follows, quote, the object of cognition is always revealed in cognition as something given, as idam, and such a revelation is due to the object's own power of intelligibility. This appears to be realism in its most naive form. Rather than addressing the Vijnanavadin's point that the appearance of objects in consciousness cannot be taken as evidence that the objects exist independently of consciousness, Vyasa merely reasserts the contrary, that the appearance of independence is itself sufficient to demonstrate that the object exists in its own right. More important for my purpose is the fact that there's nothing in the original sutra to warrant Vyasa's remark. Moreover, the remark seems to diverge from the sutra's insistence that the existence, the thatness, tattva, of the object is due not to its own inherent power, but to the integrity of the transforming activities of the gunas. These latter activities are not the formation of a world of objects independent of human cognition. It is the formation affirmation, first and foremost, of the capacities that make cognition possible, on my interpretation. Varchaspati's gloss on Vyas's commentary boils down to little more than the same flat denial of the Vijnanavada. According to Varchaspati, from the premise that all objects are accompanied by awareness, it doesn't follow that the objects have no existence other than their appearance in consciousness. The Vijnanavadi's proposal that a perceived object is nothing other than the perceptual datum is therefore, in Varchaspati's view, a mere conception, vikalpa, with no power to override our intuitive conviction that the object transcends our perception of it. Neither Vyasa nor Varchaspati denies the central contention of the Vijnanavadi, which is equivalent to Bishop Berkeley's observation that the existence of things is revealed to us only in consciousness. They simply deny the notorious Berkeleyan conclusion that the being of a thing therefore consists in its being perceived. Their argument amounts to asserting a kind of naive realism, according to which, because the world appears to comprise a range of spatially extended and temporally enduring entities, it must in reality be so comprised. It's difficult to see how this argument coheres with the main philosophical claims of Yoga and Sankhya, which primarily concern the identification and categorization of the cognitive capacities and modes of sensory and perceptual content that underlie all our experiences, including those of what we perceive as physical objects. It isn't that the Yoga Sutra and Sankhya deny the reality of physical objects, it is rather that their chief interest is in the deeper one, the deeper question, of disclosing the structure of conscious experience and the transcendental conditions that make it possible. What they provide could be described as an analysis of the constitutive conditions of possible experience, not a form of naive realism about objects in the world. But if the realist assertions of commentators such as Vyasa and Varchaspati are questionable as expositions of the original text, then whence did they arrive? Whence did they derive? It is well known that Varchaspati was eclectic in his philosophical proclivities, composing commentaries on texts from several philosophical schools. His sub-commentary to Shankara's Brahma Sutra Bhashya being his most extensive work. It's therefore evident that Varchaspati had a thorough familiarity with Shankara's Bhashya, even if it remains uncertain whether he himself, Varchaspati, was committed to Shankara's non-dualist version of Vedanta. With this in view, it's interesting to note the similarity between Varchaspati's criticism of the Yogacara Vijnanavada in his sub-commentary to Vyasa's Yoga Bhashya, and Shankara's own assault on this position in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra. A form of realism is already asserted in Shankara's commentary on Brahma Sutra 1.1.2, where Shankara declares that, quote, "The valid cognition of the true nature of a thing is not dependent on human notions." On what does it depend then, Shankara continues? It is dependent on the thing itself. Subsequently, commenting on Brahma Sutra 2.2.27 and 28, he engages in a polemic against the Vijnanavada. Discussing this in detail will take us too far afield, but it's worth summarising some salient points. One point to note is that despite Shankara's eagerness to differentiate his own view, his own position from all varieties of Buddhism, he does provide a fair account of the Vijnanavadi's view. Interestingly, he notes that according to the Vijnanavada, although external objects may exist independently of consciousness, their being presented to consciousness is necessary for the knowledge of them to arise. We therefore, on this view, have no cognitive access to an object's inherent nature. Not only to the objects, but only to the object as cognized, as an appearance. It is on this basis that the Vijnanavadi treats the object and the content of one's cognition of it as identical. by admitting that things may exist in a non-cognized state, this description of the Vijnanavada avoids the categorical denial of mind-independent entities that is typical of absolute idealism, replacing it with a phenomenological neutrality concerning the ontological status of cognized objects. In his subsequent discussion, however, Shankara ignores this distinction between ontological denial and phenomenological agnosticism about a thing's mind-independent existence, and simply imputes to his hypothetical Buddhist opponent the ontological denial, before proceeding to counter this with a form of naive realism. This is of interest because it typifies a tendency exhibited by other critics of the Vijnanavada, including Vyasa and Vachaspati. Another, 5 minutes. Brahma Sutra 228 states, with characteristic brevity, na abhava upaledhi. Not non-existent because of perception. Typically enigmatic. Shankara takes this to mean that because the act of perception is necessarily directed towards an object that is external to the perceptual state, to hold that the object exists only as perceived is contradictory. It cannot be, Shankara maintains, that the very thing perceived is non-existent. Given the prevalence of such things as dreams and hallucinations, this claim seems plausible only if perceived is understood to mean veridical perception. In that case, it would be true to say that one perceives something only if the thing in question is real. But it would also be trivial, merely true by stipulated definition, and would thus be regarded by the Vijnanavadin as failing to address the problem of how to tell whether perceptions are veridical. It is precisely this problem that the Vijnanavadin's dream analogy intends to bring into focus, as dreams exemplify objects appearing to us that, when considered from outside the dream, are recognised as mind-dependent. In this context, Shankara sees no place for an appearance-reality distinction. It's enough that perceptual objects appear mind-independent for us to conclude that they really are. Shankara thus exhibits the same uncritical espousal of realism that we encounter in Vachaspati's sub-commentary on Yoga Bhashya 4.14. Since the same basic viewpoint is taken in the Yoga Bhashya itself, which is generally held to have preceded Shankara by over 2 centuries, there's no reason to suppose that Vachaspati's position is derived solely from his immersion in Shankara's works. However, the resemblance between the viewpoints of Shankara, Vyasa and Vachaspati on this matter is sufficiently close to indicate that the latter 2 commentators need not have obtained their opinions from an exclusively yogic milieu. To conclude, despite a widespread belief that the Yoga Sutra rejects or even refutes Buddhist idealism, the belief is based largely on an uncritical acceptance of the glosses provided by traditional commentaries, most notably the Yoga Bhashya attributed to Vyasa and the Tattva Vaisharadi of Vachaspati Mishra. When the sutras are analysed in relation to the overall soteriology and metaphysics of yoga and Sankhya, the contention that they offer a defence of realism becomes problematic. In this paper, I've illustrated how, in the light of a contextualising exegetical approach, Yoga Sutra 4.14 can be understood as stating that the manifestation of empirical objects consists in, or is a consequence of, the unity or integrity of the transformational process, which comprises the mutual interplay of the gunas. Since the process in question applies first and foremost to the cognitive capacities that constitute the necessary conditions for perceptual experience, it's misleading to characterise this process as occurring independently of perceiving subjects. As I've argued at great length elsewhere, what we find in Yoga and Sankhya is a philosophical position much closer to transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant, or the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, than to the naive realism that is often ascribed to Yoga and Sankhya. Taken on its own, this claim would leave unanswered the question of why traditional commentators should have projected their own anti-Buddhist agenda onto the sutras concerned. Although a full answer to that question would require a more rigorous historical investigation than I've given here, and an exploration of all the other sutras that I refer to briefly. I've indicated that the anti-Buddhist agenda was far from limited to yoga commentators. It was pursued by other philosophical schools as well, notably Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, with which Vairocity had a strong affinity. It seems that the idealism of Yogacara Buddhism was perceived as a philosophical and sectarian threat by the Astika or Brahmanical schools, and that the Asa and Vairocity were participating in a polemical strategy of resistance. As a consequence, their treatment of certain sutras sometimes lacks the subtlety of the texts they purport to be elucidating. Thanks. Questions?
Thank you. That was a great paper. And as you know, I was talking about similar things yesterday. And it was great because you put so many issues in my mind right now. But I want to move away from the polemics just to the possibility that when you gloss this attack as against something more sophisticated, a nuanced kind of anti-realism, you move to something like phenomenology, then you're already looking at the question of a conversation about a common world. And what that implies, if you want to talk about the conditions of the possibilities of things, is that we can talk about something that isn't just our own. And so I think it's very important that in this process of the sutras, of identifying what is not your own, granted the gunas have a kind of panpsychic quality, right? So you have sattva, you have a kind of, this is a question mark to me, I don't even exactly understand this distinction. But the point is that when you identify something that is not your own, right, then you're getting out of a kind of crude subjective idealism. And so it doesn't, I mean, while there is a polemical aspect to that, this is also a necessary strategy for thinking outside of asmita and the trappings of ahankara, right, of this continual I'm thinking. So I guess what I'm saying is it's good that you represent this nuanced view, because yesterday I was bringing up naive subjective idealism, naive realism. But I think the next step, at least for me to ask, is once we accept the situatedness, once we accept that we color the object in important ways, then we have to ask how we converse about it, and to what extent this is not mine, and this is our conversation. And once we do that, I think the question of whether it's constituted by us, whether it's idealistic or not, becomes a little less important to me, right? So anyway, so that's just a comment on what you're saying, that basically, what's the next step once you've acknowledged, okay, we have to get past the crude subjective idealism, what's robust about this other kind of phenomenological aspect?
Yeah, thank you for the question. If I may, I'll answer it somewhat indirectly by saying, well, I think this is addressing the point, which is, what's, you're asking what's the next step, where do we go from there, and why is it important to present this sort of view?
Yeah, it might not just be polemical. There might be a technique, a strategy involved.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you why I think it's important, and it's this, that it's fairly widely accepted that the Yoga Darshana, if not a form of Samkhya itself, and it's pretty widely accepted that it is a form of Samkhya itself, but even if we don't accept that, it's certainly very similar to Samkhya philosophy and is drawing very heavily on the Samkhya concepts. If we take that seriously, and we take seriously the again, pretty widely held conception of Samkhya philosophy, which is absolutely central to it, is Kirtaha Sarga, the emergence of the tattvas, or the emergent principles, manifest principles from avyakta, unmanifest prakriti. That whole system of principles, if we take that to be central to Samkhya, and we think that the Yoga Sutra is either a form of Samkhya or is drawing heavily on Samkhya, then we have to acknowledge the idea that that philosophical conception is informing the yoga philosophy, might constitute a sort of background to the yoga philosophy. And we look carefully at what's going on within the Krita-Sagreha, the account of the emergence of the emergent principles, manifest principles. What we see is that the bhutas, what gets translated as the elements, but I would see them sort of forms that material objects take, hardness, liquidity, and so forth, emerge from. And I want to say emerge from, it's not clear exactly what's meant by emerge from, but they come from, they derive from, they're dependent upon ahankara. Buddhi. I want to take seriously that dependence, that conditionality. The bhutas, the forms that material objects take, are dependent on something that looks pretty psychological, pretty ideational, pretty mental. And I don't think the soteriological project of yoga can be well understood independently of taking that seriously. And when we take it seriously, what we recognise is that the soteriological project of yoga consists in a systematic, rigorous disidentification with all the emergent principles of Prakriti and unmanifest Prakriti herself, of itself. And the process of meditation, on my interpretation, is a reduction of the elaboration, the elaborateness of everyday experience to a bare minimum, within the context of which one is able to analyse the constituents of experience, and those constituents of experience are precisely the emergent manifestations of Prakriti. It's when one, within that kind of context, one's able to disidentify from them, and that's the sort of negative process. Disidentification leading to, I don't want to say the positive realization of oneself as Purusha, but Purusha is the reverse side, as it were. Don't know, I started rambling there a bit, but I tried to contextualize my own, this paper.
Well, it's interesting that the distinction finally has to be that Purusha is not that, right?
Not that,
so these psychological elements are, I'm confused about them, so you bring up this confusion.
But are you questioning the parinama itself, the existence of the gunas themselves, which Das Gupta calls reals, that are really out there? You're not questioning the existence of a property in some kind of the gunas themselves. You're questioning the forms that these take. So there's still a dualism in your understanding. Okay. Because I read one of your articles where it seemed you would suggest that you were taking a kind of a Dvaita take on the Yoga Sutras. Were you not? No? Okay. I must have misread it.
Can I properly respond to it? Yeah, I read your interpretation of my article, and I was amazed. You said something like, this is just flat Advaita, or something like this is just straightforward Advaita. No, I fully, I said at the beginning of this paper that I recognise that Sankhya is dualist. I mean, by definition, if we were going to characterise Sankhya and hence yoga, Patanjali yoga philosophy, dualism has got to be very much at the head of that characterisation, and Purusha and Prakriti are precisely the two principles that make it a dualism.
Sorry about that. When I was writing the commentary in the good old days, you could run home and fix things, but unfortunately it's too late.
No, it's partly mine.
I want to ask you one question. There have been references both in your paper and papers yesterday to Burley's essentially solipsistic view of the universe. And I would like to ask you to explore a little bit about something that I think has been overlooked thus far in these discussions, and that is nomenologically contingent reality. And that is, and I think it's a very important concept, because when something is conferred or given a name in Sanskrit, not in so much in English, but in Sanskrit, the Shabdam has an independent existence of its name and its contingency. The contingency essentially detaches, and because we know that these same objects exist elsewhere, on the planet other than in front of us. And I'd like to explore this, have you explore this from the point of view of, if we're all in agreement that Sankhya and yoga are dualistic, particularly Sankhya is a dualistic philosophy, then yoga functions as a kind of manifold or container, the way that picture on the desk functions as a manifold and a container for the water or the Sankhya content within it. And we can't speak of the contents without the manifold. And I think that if you look at it in this way, these ideas that you go back to Burley and Kant, and I just wonder, you know, if Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz were alive today, what would he say about all this?
I have no idea what Leibniz would say about all this. So the nomonologically contingent reality. The idea that sorry, I didn't follow you entirely, but the idea that by naming something, you somehow attribute reality to it. Is that the thought? And how does that relate to Sankhya and yoga philosophy?
Because when you name something, you have set within the linguistic content.
When you name something, especially in Sanskrit, you have set a symbol and given it a value. And anybody else who uses that symbol and that value, that shabdam, to describe the same object or something similar, water would be, jal would be a good example of that. We know that water exists all over the planet. And to say that the reality is contingent upon my perception of it, unless the symbol set, the recognition of the symbol value is part of that perception, I'm just not sure that this model of, because I don't perceive it, it doesn't exist, I don't think that works for me.
Yeah, so I tried in the paper I presented just now to distinguish between two sort of senses of reality or two senses of exist. And the way that I did that was to talk about formal or apparent existence on one hand, the forms that things take in our experience, and what I call subject independent existence on the other. And I mean, I certainly don't want to impose a Western philosophical conceptualization on the Indian material, but I find that some aspects of Kantian philosophy are helpful as a kind of bridge of understanding. So I was citing Kant in relation to this kind of distinction between a thing in itself, independent of anybody's thinking it, perceiving it, on the one hand, and the way that it appears to us in experience on the other. And so I think that the level at which naming takes place is at the level of appearance, and no, I think
yeah, I know that a lot of us have questions. I know Philip and you've been waiting, and Ian. I just want to give Anna enough time to present her paper. Perhaps afterward we can continue this discussion because I think there's a lot more to be said. So I want to thank